The silence of a Boston winter has a weight to it. A heavy, freezing stillness that presses against the window panes of the historic brownstone in Beacon Hill. Victoria Vance was awake. She had been awake for hours, staring at the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the sheer curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floor. It was exactly 2:07 a.m. when her phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sharp, mechanical hum shattered the quiet room. She reached out, her fingers cold against the glass screen. It was a text message from Julian, her husband of 7 years. "Harper and I are leaving. We need space. Don't look for us. We're never coming back." Victoria sat up, the linen sheets slipping from her shoulders. Her heart did not hammer, it slowed to a dull, heavy thud. For months, there had been a phantom distance between them, an invisible wall that she had attributed to the stress of Julian's struggling logistics consulting firm. But the mention of Harper, her closest friend since their days at Wellesley College, the woman who had delivered the eulogy at her mother's funeral, felt like a physical blow to the sternum. Mechanically, Victoria opened Instagram. She didn't check Julian's profile. He was notoriously private. She checked a burner account she used for market research and looked up an anonymous travel tag for luxury resorts. There it was, a freshly posted photo from a mutual acquaintance who happened to be vacationing on the Amalfi coast of Italy, in the background of a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the azure Tyrrhenian Sea. Two figures sat close together. It was Julian and Harper. The camera had caught them in a candid laugh. Harper was wearing a custom platinum emerald pendant. Victoria felt a sickening lurch in her throat. She had given Harper that very pendant for her 30th birthday. It was a unique piece, commissioned from a local jeweler in Boston. There was no mistaking it. The betrayal was not merely emotional, it was a curated, luxury performance. Victoria's thumb hovered over the call button. Her chest tightened with the desperate, human urge to scream into the receiver, to demand an explanation, to tear down the illusion. But she stopped. She took a long, shuddering breath, exhaling the cold air of the bedroom. Anger was a wildfire, but precision was ice. She tapped the text field and typed a 2-word reply. "Good luck." She locked her phone and opened her sleek, silver laptop. Logging into her private banking portal, she bypassed the joint household accounts and went straight to her primary corporate-backed asset pool, the wealth she had built independently as the founder of a high-end architectural restoration firm. Her breath caught. The first-class flights to Naples, the reservation at the cliffside villa in Positano, the expensive dinners. Every single expense had been routed through an authorized secondary card tied to her personal capital line. Julian hadn't just run away with her best friend, he had financed their romantic escape using her sweat and blood. With cold, deliberate clicks, Victoria systematically revoked Julian's access. She froze the credit lines, deactivated the secondary cards, and changed the passwords to their shared cloud storage and home security networks. It was a digital execution, clean and absolute. But just before she closed the browser, a strange transaction caught her eye. It was a pending wire transfer of $15,000 to an obscure entity listed only as Aegis Holdings LLC. She didn't recognize the name, but fatigue was finally pulling her under. She closed the laptop, intending to investigate in the morning. She lay back down in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. But dawn did not bring peace. It brought a sharp, authoritative knock at the heavy oak front door. The two police officers standing on Victoria's doorstep looked uncomfortable, their heavy blue coats dusted with fresh snow. The morning light was gray and unforgiving. "Mrs. Victoria Vance?" the older officer asked. checking a small notepad. Yes, Victoria said, keeping her voice level, despite the exhaustion scraping at her eyes. How can I help you? Officers, we received a call from an attorney representing your husband, Julian Vance. The officer explained, stepping into the warmth of the foyer. He claims that you have illegally locked him out of his primary residence, seized his corporate operational assets, and left him stranded abroad without access to funds or identification documents. He is alleging domestic financial abuse and unlawful asset seizure. Victoria let out a soft, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity of the move was breathtaking. Julian wasn't running away in shame, he was positioning himself as the victim. He had anticipated her anger, counted on her, locking him out, and used it to construct a narrative where she was the cold, controlling matriarch destroying his life. Please come inside, Victoria said calmly. She led them into her immaculate, high-ceilinged study and opened her laptop. This is the deed to the house, she said, pointing to the digital documents. The property was purchased entirely through my family trust prior to our marriage. It is entirely in my name. And these are my personal bank accounts, which I have frozen. My husband has his own corporate accounts for his consulting firm. If he is stranded, it is because he chose to fly to Italy on my credit card without my authorization. She pulled up the text message from 2:07 a.m. and showed it to the officers. He left of his own accord. With another woman. I simply stopped paying for the trip. The officers exchanged a look. The younger one nodded slowly, understanding the reality of the situation. Look, Mrs. Vance, this clearly looks like a civil matter. A bitter divorce dispute. We can't force you to give him access to your personal funds. And since the house is solely in your name, we can't compel you to let him in. But we have to file a report. Our advice? Get a very good lawyer immediately. If he's already calling the police from Italy, this is going to get ugly fast. After the officers left, Victoria sat back in her leather chair, her mind racing. She opened the banking portal again to look closer at Aegis Holdings LLC. Now that she was fully awake, she dug deeper into the transaction history. Exporting the past 12 months of records into a spreadsheet, what she found made the cold room feel suddenly microscopic. The $15,000 from last night was not an isolated incident. There was a rhythmic, recurring pattern of transfers disguised as payments to sub-vendors for Julian's logistics company. $5,000 here, $12,000 there. The names were subtly varied: Aegis Consulting, Aegis Logistics, Aegis Media. Victoria's fingers flew across the keyboard, calculating the aggregate sum of these hidden transactions. When the final number popped up at the bottom of the column, her breath left her entirely. It wasn't a few $1,000s for a vacation. Over $84,000 had been systematically drained from her accounts over the last year. It was a meticulous, slow-motion theft. By noon, the study was filled with the aroma of black coffee and the sharp, professional presence of Eleanor Cross. Eleanor was more than Victoria's attorney. She was a forensic powerhouse. A woman who viewed divorce not as an emotional tragedy, but as a financial war of attrition. Alongside her was Marcus, a digital forensics specialist who looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. We need to preserve every scrap of data immediately, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, commanding cadence. Julian's play with the police tells us everything we need to know. He is desperate, and desperate men make loud moves to distract from quiet crimes. Marcus was already plugged into Victoria's network, his fingers moving across a specialized dual-screen terminal. I'm tracking Aegis Holdings LLC, he muttered, It's a classic shell company registered in Delaware. No physical office. Just a registered agent at a corporate filing mill. But I managed to pull the banking routing data for the receiving account. He turned his screen toward Victoria. The account belongs to Harper Sterling. It's the account she uses for her high-end interior styling business. Victoria stared at the screen. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap into place. The luxury apartment Harper had leased in the Seaport district last spring, the brand new BMW she claimed she had bought with a generous inheritance from an aunt. The expensive professional liability insurance, it hadn't been funded by Harper's business. It had been funded by Victoria. Julian had been robbing his own wife to build a parallel life for his mistress. A wave of memories washed over Victoria, each one carrying a fresh sting of foolishness. The nights Julian stayed late at the office fixing supply chain bottlenecks. The weekends Harper was out of town styling a coastal estate. The way they would exchange subtle, knowing glances across the dinner table while Victoria talked about her architectural projects. The affair hadn't begun on a beach in Amalfi. It had been negotiated and financed from inside her own bank statements. It gets worse. Victoria, Eleanor warned, her expression grim. To file criminal charges for grand larceny or bank fraud. We have to prove that these transfers were completely unauthorized. We need to show that Julian accessed your system illegally. Marcus clicked a button, bringing up an authorization log from Victoria's secure corporate banking portal. I checked the security certificates for the transfers. Every single wire transfer to Aegis Holdings was validated using a multi-factor authentication token and an encrypted digital signature. Whose signature? Victoria asked, a terrible dread rising in her throat. Marcus looked up, his eyes apologetic. Yours. Victoria. The system shows that you electronically signed and approved every single contract and payment order. The IP address traces back to the desktop computer in Julian's downtown office, but the cryptographic key is uniquely yours. Eleanor leaned forward, her face dead serious. If we can't prove that your digital signature was stolen or forged, the law will view this as a domestic dispute over funds you legally agreed to share. You won't just lose the money. Victoria. You could be held legally liable for his business debts if he used your signature to guarantee them. The romantic illusion of the Amalfi Coast lasted exactly 36 hours. Without Victoria's credit cards to pay for the cliffside villa, the vintage wine, and the private boat tours, the luxury resort in Positano grew hostile. When Julian's frozen cards were rejected at the front desk, the manager politely but firmly demanded immediate wire payment or cash. Holding their luggage as collateral, stripped of their financial armor, the grand romantic escape devolved into a panicked, humiliating flight back to Boston. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Victoria heard the heavy metallic thud of the front door handle being rattled violently from the outside. She didn't move from her position on the sofa. She had expected this. A key turned in the lock, the physical key she hadn't changed yet. On Eleanor's advice, and the door swung open. Julian stepped into the foyer, his face flushed with rage, his expensive trench coat soaked with rain. Behind him stood Harper, looking cold, exhausted, and thoroughly unglamorous, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Julian shouted, slamming the door behind them. "You turned off the cards? You left us stranded in a foreign country? Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Victoria looked at him, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. "You left a note saying you were never coming back." "Julian, why would I keep paying for a life you chose to live without me?" Julian walked into the living room, attempting to reclaim his space. But there was a tremor in his hands. "We came back to get what belongs to me. I'm not leaving without my things. And specifically, I need the old legacy external hard drive from the study desk. The one with the archived firm data. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't rushed to the closet to grab his tailored suits. He hadn't asked about their dog or his personal papers. His primary, desperate objective was an old, silver Western digital hard drive that sat in the back of her desk drawer. That was where the evidence lay. That was where the software or the templates used to harvest her digital signature were hidden. Seeing her silence, Julian changed his tactics. He dropped into a chair, his voice softening into a rehearsed tone of emotional manipulation. Victoria, look. Things got out of hand. Harper. She pressured me. She told me our marriage was dead. She seduced me when I was vulnerable with the business failing. I made a mistake. It was a momentary lapse in judgment. If you unlock the corporate operational lines and let me get the firm's data archive, we can settle this quietly. I can come back home. We can fix this. Harper gasped, her face turning a vivid, angry crimson. You cowardly liar, she shrieked. Stepping forward, you told me you hated her. You told me she was a cold, unfeeling machine who controlled every dollar and treated you like a child. You were the one who came up with the Aegis transfers. You promised me she was too busy with her historic renovations to ever notice the missing cash. The ugly, desperate reality of their partnership lay exposed in the middle of the room. It wasn't a grand, sweeping love story. It was a parasitic alliance built on greed. And the moment the host stopped feeding them, they turned on each other like starved animals. Before Julian could reply, the blue flashing lights of 2 police cruisers reflected against the wet pavement outside. Victoria had called them the moment she heard the key in the lock. She stood up, walked over to Julian, and dropped a thick manila envelope onto his lap. These are the divorce papers, Victoria said quietly. I suggest you take them. Take your mistress and leave. The police are outside to ensure you don't take anything else. Julian glared at her, his eyes full of venom as the officers knocked on the glass door. This isn't over. Victoria, you think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you've already signed. After the police escorted the shouting, arguing pair from the property, the house fell into a profound silence. Victoria walked into her study. On her laptop screen, a progress bar reached 100%. Marcus's automated script had finally finished a deep, brute force decryption scan of Julian's old corporate cloud backup folder. A directory labeled Archived Corporate Assets clicked open. The content of the decrypted folder was a masterclass in white-collar betrayal. Victoria and Eleanor spent the entire night reviewing the files. The light from the dual monitors illuminating their grim faces. Julian hadn't just stolen $84,000 in cash. He had used Victoria's forged digital signature to execute a series of complex corporate indemnity agreements and personal guarantees. He had used her stellar credit rating and her architectural firm's asset valuation to secure a massive $300,000 line of credit for his failing logistics company from a private secondary lender. If his company defaults on these loans, which it will, considering its financial state, the lenders have the legal right to come after your personal properties, Eleanor explained, her voice sharp with professional concern. They can place a lien on this house. They can freeze your business operating accounts. This isn't just a messy divorce anymore. Victoria, this is a coordinated attempt to completely bankrupt you to keep his sinking ship afloat. The phone on the desk rang. It was Julian's newly retained defense attorney, a notorious legal street fighter named Vance Sterling. His tone was smug, dripping with practiced confidence. Mrs. Vance, I'm calling to advise you to drop this ridiculous narrative of financial theft, the lawyer said over the speakerphone. My client has just provided me with an extensive archive of email correspondence between the two of you. These emails clearly show that you explicitly authorized the use of your digital signature for these specific credit lines to help support his business during a difficult quarter. We have the written consent, time-stamped, and sent from your personal email address. Victoria felt a cold drop of sweat trace down her spine. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, she began to doubt her own reality. Gaslighting is a powerful poison. It makes you question your own memory. Had she signed something during a late night of exhaustion? Had she given him a broad power of attorney years ago when they were happy and she wasn't paying attention? Send us the files. Eleanor snapped, cutting off the lawyer's smug monologue. We'll see you in court. Within minutes, the PDF copies of the alleged consent emails arrived in Eleanor's inbox. Victoria leaned in close, her eyes scanning the text. The emails looked authentic. They used her exact tone, her typical sign-offs, and came from her primary email address. But as Victoria stared at the attached signature authorization forms, her architectural eye for minute detail caught something. The files were named using a highly specific convention: Vic, Vance, Auth, 2021, Final. BNA. Victoria's breath hitched. Eleanor, look at the file name. The signature image they used. It's labeled 2021. So, maybe he just saved an old file. Eleanor countered. No. Victoria said, a sudden spark of absolute certainty igniting in her chest. In 2021. I didn't use this digital signature provider. I only switched to this encrypted platform in late 2023. And more importantly, that specific file name, with the underscores and the capitalized final, was part of an archive design folder I created when I was organizing my mother's estate documents after she passed away. Julian never had access to that folder. He doesn't even know how my personal archive is structured. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his fingers typing rapidly. Let's check the cloud download logs for that specific 2021 estate archive. He tracked the server metadata back through 5 years of activity. The screen flashed red. Found it, Marcus said, a grim smile appearing on his face. The user who logged into your personal cloud archive and downloaded that signature file wasn't Julian. The login occurred from an IP address registered to Harper Sterling's interior design studio. The revelation shifted the entire axis of the conflict. Harper was not merely a passive mistress enjoying the fruits of Julian's theft, she was the architect of the forgery itself. Victoria remembered the dark weeks following her mother's death in the winter of 2021. She had been completely incapacitated by grief, unable to handle the mountain of paperwork, the estate cataloging, and the moving logistics. Harper had moved into the brownstone for 2 weeks, ostensibly to help her best friend. She had been given Victoria's laptop, her cloud passwords, and her total, unreserved trust to help manage the estate. While Victoria was weeping in the other room, Harper had been systematically copying her digital signature files, her personal identification documents, and mapping out the structure of her financial accounts. Julian provided the opportunity and the motive because his firm was bleeding cash. Eleanor mused, pacing the floor. But Harper provided the technical execution. She was the one who built the shell companies, forged the invoices, and chiseled away at your wealth. Julian didn't have the patience or the technical eye for this level of detail. Eleanor didn't waste a single hour. Armed with the new metadata evidence, she filed an emergency petition for an ex parte civil injunction, freezing every single bank account tied to Harper Sterling, her design firm, and Julian Vance. She served them with an immediate demand for the preservation of all digital evidence. accompanied by a warning that federal bank fraud charges were being prepared for the district attorney. The pressure was immediate and crushing. 2 days later, Harper's personal defense attorney called Eleanor with an urgent request for a private meeting. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room downtown. Harper looked utterly broken. The luxury veneer had completely dissolved, her accounts were frozen. Her clients were jumping ship as rumors of financial fraud spread through the tight-knit Boston design community. And she was facing a very real possibility of a federal prison sentence. "I didn't want to ruin her," Harper whispered, refusing to look Victoria in the eye. Her voice was trembling. "Julian told me it was just a temporary loan. He said Victoria had millions, that she wouldn't even notice a few $1,000s a month until his firm got a new government logistics contract. He said we deserve to be happy. Save the poetry." "Harper," Eleanor said coldly, sliding a folder across the mahogany table. "You stole her mother's legacy files while she was mourning. You forged her name to secure loans that could have bankrupted her. If you want to avoid a maximum security facility, you need to give us something absolute." Harper swallowed hard, her knuckles white. She realized that Julian was already preparing to throw her under the bus, claiming he was an innocent husband misled by an aggressive mistress. The criminal alliance was completely dead. It was now a race to see who could betray the other first to secure a plea deal. Julian is planning to liquidate his company's remaining offshore assets and flee to a non-extradition country, Harper confessed, her voice cracking. "He didn't put all the money into my Aegis account. He has a secret, unlisted corporate account with a private boutique bank in the Cayman Islands. He kept the bulk of the line of credit money there. He was planning to dump me too." Once the investigation got too close, she reached into her purse and pulled out an encrypted USB drive. "This contains our entire WhatsApp chat history from the last 2 years. Every plan, every instruction from Julian telling me how to format the fake invoices, and his explicit admission that he was using a secret account to hide the loan money from Victoria." The courtroom of the Massachusetts Superior Court was quiet, filled with the clean, antiseptic smell of polished wood and old paper. Judge Evelyn Martinez sat at the elevated bench, her sharp eyes scanning the legal teams below. Julian's attorney opened with an aggressive, scorched earth strategy. He painted Victoria as an icy, vindictive, emotionally abusive wife who used her massive independent wealth to emasculate her husband. "Your Honor, this is not a case of fraud," the lawyer argued, his voice booming through the courtroom. "This is a tragic case of a wealthy spouse using her financial superiority as a weapon. My client, Julian Vance, was a partner in a legitimate business trying to survive an economic downturn. His wife gave him explicit permission to use her digital signature to secure these credit lines. Now that the marriage has failed due to an unfortunate personal indiscretion, she is retroactively claiming forgery to ruin him criminally. This is an abuse of the court system to exact personal revenge." Julian sat next to his lawyer, looking pale but projecting an air of wounded dignity. He looked at Victoria with a carefully practiced expression of sorrow and betrayal, as if he were the one who had been wronged. Eleanor stood up. She didn't engage in the emotional theater. She didn't talk about the affair, the trip to Amalfi, or the broken promises of marriage. She focused entirely on the beautiful, unyielding reality of data. "Your Honor, we are not here to debate the emotional temperature of a failed marriage," Eleanor said calmly. "We are here to examine a crime of forgery and corporate fraud." She called Marcus to the stand. The digital forensics specialist projected a massive chart onto the courtroom screen, displaying the deep metadata of the alleged consent emails that Julian's team had submitted as proof of Victoria's authorization. We examined the underlying mail transfer agent logs and the cryptographic timestamps of the emails submitted by the defense. Marcus testified, his voice steady and clinical. The headers show that while the display date on the email reads March 14, 2024, the actual cryptographic server generation date was June 12, 2026. The emails were backdated using a modified local mail server script. The courtroom fell into a dead silence. Julian's lawyer stood up to object, but his voice lacked conviction. Furthermore, Marcus continued, switching to a high-resolution graphic comparison. We analyzed the digital signature image attached to the authorization forms. The cryptographic hash of the signature matches perfectly with a file downloaded from Mrs. Vance's private cloud archive in 2021, an archive that was accessed exclusively by an IP address belonging to Harper Sterling during a period when Mrs. Vance was away from her device. Eleanor then introduced the encrypted USB drive containing the WhatsApp chat history provided by Harper. The messages were devastating. Julian's own words detailed exactly how they would manipulate the system, forge the documents, and hide the proceeds in the Cayman Islands account. The defense's victim paradigm collapsed instantly under the weight of the metadata. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her expression thunderous as she looked down at Julian. The evidence presented by the plaintiff is overwhelming, Judge Martinez declared, her gavel resting in her hand. This court finds a substantial likelihood of systemic fraud, forgery, and asset concealment. I am granting an immediate extension of the asset freeze, including the newly identified Cayman Islands account. Furthermore, I am referring this entire matter, along with the digital forensics logs, to the District Attorney's White-Collar Crime Division for immediate criminal investigation and indictment. As the court adjourned, Julian stood frozen at his table. He looked across the room at Victoria, his face completely drained of color. For a fleeting second, his eyes held a pathetic, desperate plea, a look that begged her to step in and save him one last time, as she had done so many times during their marriage when his business ventures failed. Victoria met his gaze for a single, seul moment, then turned her back on him and walked out into the winter afternoon. 6 months passed. The snows of Boston melted away, replaced by the sharp green leaves and warm breezes of a New England summer. The brownstone in Beacon Hill was quiet again, but it was a peaceful, clean quietness. The fallout from the legal battle had been absolute. Julian's logistics firm collapsed into involuntary bankruptcy under the weight of the frozen accounts and the fraud investigation. He was currently awaiting trial on multiple federal counts of wire fraud and grand larceny, his expensive defense team having abandoned him the moment his funds vanished. Harper Sterling had avoided immediate prison through her cooperation deal, but her career was completely destroyed. Her design studio was bankrupt. Her reputation in the city was ruined, and she was forced to liquidate her personal assets to pay a massive civil restitution judgment to Victoria. Victoria did not win a perfect victory. She did not get all her money back. Between the unrecoverable funds Julian had spent abroad, the massive legal fees, and the costs of the forensic investigators, her personal capital had taken a significant, painful hit. It was a realistic conclusion. Justice in the real world is rarely free, and it rarely returns. Everything that was stolen, but she had kept her home. She had insulated her design firm from the wreckage, and most importantly, she had preserved her clarity. She was sitting in her study on a quiet Tuesday evening, watching the sunset cast golden light across her desk, when her phone vibrated. It was an email notification from a generic correctional facility communications network. It was a message from Julian. Victoria. It read, "The trial is next month. I'm looking at 5 to 7 years. I know I destroyed everything, but I need to know. Can you ever forgive me?" Can you remember the people we used to be? Victoria looked at the words on the screen. A year ago. A message like this would have triggered a storm of pain, anger, or agonizing self-doubt. Now, she felt absolutely nothing but a mild, distant pity. The illusion had been completely stripped away. And without the illusion, Julian was simply a small, desperate man who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. She didn't delete the email. She didn't reply. She simply closed the browser tab, leaving the message unanswered in the digital void. She didn't need to hate him anymore. Hatred was an emotional investment, and she had officially closed his account. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked down to a local community center in South Boston. Once a month, she volunteered at a financial literacy workshop for women who were transitioning out of difficult domestic situations. As she sat down at a folding table across from a young woman who looked terrified, clutching a folder of messy papers, Victoria smiled gently. She reached out and helped the woman open her very first independent bank statement. Julian thought the worst thing he could take from me was my marriage. He was wrong. The worst thing he took was my trust. And the most important thing he left behind was the chance to rebuild it with myself.